And what we've seen is that when you have the unregulated deployment or use of an actor like Wagner, there's a very strong risk of human rights violations or violations of the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions. There's a very high risk of them being violated. And that's exactly what we've seen happening in these different situations of armed conflict. So in Central African Republic, we've seen allegations of widespread killings, torture, forced disappearances, detention, looting, and in some instances, widespread and indiscriminate targeting of civilians. I know that's an important one because it takes those activities to the level of war crimes. And we've seen this pattern play out in Libya, maybe not to such a widespread extent, but the types of violations that have taken place are very, very similar. And so the working group is always very concerned that when you have unregulated actors like this participating in armed conflicts, it's hugely problematic from a human rights perspective. We've seen evidence that these mercenaries are in fact being rewarded by access to concessions to natural resources, to mining concessions. And so there's been an involvement of some local companies. We see some local companies in Central African Republic that are set up in the country, but are actually owned by Russians. And there's evidence that they're involved in managing the financial arrangements around the so-called Wagner Group. And so this is a pattern that's emerging where third-party countries are participating in armed conflicts, but they're doing so in an indirect way and in a way that gives them plausible deniability. And that's hugely problematic. But that's one of the trends that we're seeing. Another trend that we're seeing is that the use of these types of actors in armed conflicts results in what we call asymmetric warfare, where we're seeing these actors bringing in very heavy duty, very serious weapons into the armed conflict, and causing huge harm to civilian populations in particular, because of their indiscriminate use of these weapons. And I think the third thing that we're seeing with this type of use of mercenaries is that we're seeing that the actual mercenaries themselves are being recruited from a variety of different places. So in Libya, for example, there are allegations that Russia and Turkey recruited individuals from, for example, Syria, and took advantage of the ongoing armed conflict there and the socioeconomic situation in Syria to recruit individuals. Now, some of them know that they were being recruited as mercenaries and perhaps have a background as fighters in armed conflicts in the Middle East, and which of course presents huge problems in terms of knowing their human rights history, knowing their war crimes history. But some of them simply don't know that that's what they're being recruited to do. They thought they were being recruited to be security guards, for example, and suddenly they've ended up in Nagorno-Karabakh, or they've ended up in Libya, and suddenly they're having weapons put into their hands and they're fighting in the armed conflict, and that was not something that was known to them. If you look at if we come back to the Central African Republic, one of the big concerns there is that the population just doesn't have access to justice. So the government has put in place a commission of inquiry, but there's evidence that there aren't many complaints going to that commission of inquiry, because you've got the Russians being very much inextricably linked to the police, for example. So people simply aren't going to the police to make a complaint to say that their rights are being violated, because when they do so, they're harassed, they're perhaps detained, they're perhaps tortured, and so you've got this chilling effect on, you know, the whole justice system. People don't want to actually make a complaint, don't actually want to say my rights have been violated by mercenaries, and they're scared. They're scared to seek justice.